We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And with those words, a few others, the United States was born 250 years ago. And really that Declaration of Independence and our Constitution really form who we are as a nation. And this morning, with the kind of founding fathers in the backdrop, you've been looking at the founding father of faith. And so Abram, what happens today is really the foundation of God's relationship and his covenant with Abram. And so a beautiful passage from the Bible, but as I say, a difficult passage for us to maybe understand because it's rooted in some very cultural things of the day. And so our passage started off after these things. And so after these things, Abram was called by God. You might remember the story. He was living in Mesopotamia, Ur of Chaldeans, and God said, "Go to a land that I will show you." And he walked, like some 1,000 miles he walked, leaving all the known behind, going to the unknown. And and God didn't just say to go, but he said, "You will be a great nation. I will bless you, and I will give you this land and descendants." But there are a couple of challenges that Abram ran into, the first being a famine that took him to Egypt, and then prosperity, if that can be a challenge as well. And he and his nephew Lot became so prolific in their livestock and their people that they had to split. The land was not going to support them both. And so Lot went one way. He took the good-looking land, but was not a good choice, and Abram took the other spot. And so Lot got in trouble. And the previous chapter, so we're in Genesis 15, in chapter 14 is this kind of international war that happens between 4 kings against 5 kings. They have really hard to pronounce names. Glad we're not talking about that one today. And out of that battle, Lot, Abram's nephew, gets whisked away into captivity. And so Abram and his 318 men in his household, the servants, they go and rescue Lot and bring him back. And it's at the end of chapter 14 is that kind of odd interchange with Melchizedek, if you're familiar with that. So, but out of that chapter 14, it really reminds us that Abram is in a hostile land. I mean, he's a pilgrim in kind of a scary place. And then after these things, the Lord appears to Abram in our passage and says, "I am your shield and your very great reward." And I love that God is continuing to help Abram understand who he is. And so, I am your shield. Think about, what is a shield? It's an element of protection in battle, which is perfectly spoken to Abram, who has just experienced this battle around. And for God to say, I'm going to be your shield. I am going to be your protector. And your reward will be very great. I will be your very great reward. Again, at the end of chapter 14, Abram declines taking the spoils of war because he trusts in God alone. And so as we have these stories of Abram, they're also very much stories of who our God is. And so, I think what God is great is he doesn't expect us to know all the facets of him, but as we go through life, we get different aspects of God that come forth. And so here, I'm your shield. Your reward will be very great. And God is speaking very specific here to Abram's specific circumstances. And then Abram's response is, well, I got a question. Well, you haven't given me an heir. And we think to ourselves, God's talking over here and Abram's talking over here. What's the disconnect here? And one thing, just stepping back, what I love is that God engages with Abram. Like, he's not bothered by the fact that Abram's asking questions. In part, Abram's questions are not out of a lack of faith. Because he trusts God, because he believes in God, he's willing to ask the questions. And kind of the question is, well, in some ways, what good is this if I don't have an heir? And so Abram is this great model of faith throughout. And yeah, if you give me a great blessing, well, that's fine, but I can't pass it on to anyone. Typically you would find Abram did not have children at this point, and you would put it, maybe like us, we would give the inheritance to someone close to you. Well, Lot has proved a wee bit unreliable. And so the best that Abram has is Eliezer of Damascus, this servant in his own household. And we actually know that was a practice in the ancient world. Go with me on a rabbit trail here real fast. There was a archaeological find in the 1930s. The site was called Nuzi, N-U-Z-I. And at Nuzi, they found clay tablets written, and it really documented like average life. And it stems back from this patriarchal period when Abram was living. And in there, they did find documents that made reference to adopting a servant in your household to carry on as your heir. But God says, no, it's not going to be Eliezer, but an actual heir. And then he takes him outside and has him look up at the stars. I love those kiddos. There are a bajillion stars out there. I love it. And, he looked up at the sky, and he said, that's what your descendants are going to be. And it says that Abram believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And if you thought to yourself, that phrase sounds familiar, you're right. It shows up. Paul uses it. James uses it in the New Testament for the importance of faith. Abram believed the Lord. Oftentimes when we think about faith in our world, well, I have faith in God, you mean that you believe God exists. But no, what Abram did is he believed in God. He believed that God was trustworthy and would bring about what God had promised. The Jewish publication translation will put it, Abram put his trust in the Lord, which is actually quite extraordinary because he was 75 when he left Haran. And, it's been a good 10 years at least until he's gotten to the promised land and still no heir. And yet he believed. When God speaks, things come true. What God says comes to fruition. And so may we have faith like Abram, not just believing that God exists, but that God can and will act in our lives. And then Abram asks another question. Well, how will I know? Hebrew word of the day is know, yada. And he's, again, asking out of curiosity, not as much out of doubt. To know in the Hebrew language was more than just like head knowledge, but like experiential knowing. How am I going to know this? I kind of feel like his prayer is a little bit, or his conversation is a little bit like one who talked to Jesus in the Gospels, the man who said, I believe, help my unbelief. Abram, like, how am I going to know this? Again, Abram has had these experiences with God. He believed that God was trustworthy. He rescued him in Egypt. He rescued him after the famine. He rescued him to get Lot. And yet, Abram continues to ask with an amount of faith. And God responds using his words. I don't know if you noticed it, but, Abram asks, how is it that my only heir is Eliezer? And God responds, no, I'm going to give you an heir. Abram asks, how will I know? And God says, no, for certain. So God's directly answering Abram's question using the words that Abram is asking about. God speaks very specifically to us. And then God asks Abram to bring a heifer, a ram, a goat, and 2 birds. Little odd, okay. And then Abram splits them. God never talked about splitting these animals. What in the world is going on? But when God asked Abram to bring the animals, Abram knew exactly what was going on. And this is where there's this cultural time lapse because we don't understand. You know, when we want to make an agreement with someone, we get the lawyers involved, right? There's paperwork, there's signatures. Even if you don't go that sophisticated, at least a handshake makes a deal. This predates all of that. When you were going to make an agreement with someone, it was called cutting a covenant. Now, this is Old Testament, folks. Sorry, it gets a little gory. Bear with me. So what you would do if you were going to make an agreement with someone, you would bring animals. You would find a place that had like a bit of a trench, and you would cut the animals in 2. You would lay one half of the animal on one side, one half of the animal on the other side, and what would flow down? I said it was going to be gory. And then the 2 people making this agreement would walk that path. Well, if you're going to walk that path, what's going to get on your feet? Yeah. Ew. Yes. And essentially, as you're making this agreement, you're saying, I will uphold my part of the bargain. If I don't, you can do to me what we've done to these animals. My blood is yours. And so when Abram is told by God to bring these animals, Abram knows this is going to be a serious thing that he is going to be involved with God. C.S. Lewis wrote a book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He wrote more than that. But in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Christ-like figure is a lion by the name of Aslan. And at one point in Narnia, the land where these children end up, they're talking animals. And at one point, they're talking about Aslan, and one of the human children turns to the beaver family and says, well, is he safe? And the beavers respond, of course he's not safe, but he's good. And we kind of get that feeling right here that God is not necessarily safe, but he's good. He's going to make this agreement with Abram. And Abram knows that there is serious, his blood is on the line, his life is on the line as he makes this agreement. And as the sun set, it says that Abram fell into a deep sleep and dreadful darkness. The King James Version, behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. When God puts you to sleep in the Bible, something big is going to happen. It's the same term of sleep that's used in Genesis chapter 2 when God put Adam to sleep and stole one of his ribs to make Eve. So Abram is in this deep sleep, and Abram's a little bit freaked out. Despite the fact the very beginning of our passage, God said to Abram, do not fear. He understands if he fails in this agreement, it's going to be his life. And yet in the midst of his sleep, God then assures him that Abram's going to have offspring, but they're going to be aliens in a foreign land. But don't worry, because God's going to pass judgment on that foreign country, and his descendants are going to come out with great possessions. And, Abram's going to have a long and peaceful life, and Abram's descendants would come back to this land in the 4th generation. And we think, why is God telling all of this stuff that's going to happen in the future? I think it reminds us that God is in control. And when we open the book of Exodus, all that God unpacks, or all that God says here, becomes unpacked in that Exodus story. So God had it all. He knew what was going to happen. And then as the darkness comes, who walked the path? Who cut the covenant? A smoking fire pot and a blazing torch go through, and God often shows up in fire, I think about in the Exodus, the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. On Mount Sinai, there was fire, God's presence even at Pentecost in fire. And who walks through? God did. But what about Abram? He doesn't. And so it's very personal that God walked the path for both of them. Essentially, God's saying, if I'm unfaithful, you can have my blood, but if you're unfaithful, I will give of my blood as well. And we know this happens because we know that Abram's descendants did not keep up their end of the bargain, and what happened? God's own son, Jesus, gave of his blood that we might be in relationship. So the covenant was not based on anything Abram, but it was on the basis of God's faithfulness, which is so extraordinary if you think about the time in which Abram lived. The people didn't know what the gods wanted. The world was chaotic and weird, and so they would sacrifice their children to the gods, hoping to appease them. And this God doesn't want human sacrifice. He's willing to sacrifice himself to be in relationship with his people. So incredible is this story. And so Abram is this beautiful example of faith. And stepping back, God is not bothered by our questions. Abram questioned God because he deeply believed in God. And so when we hit unknowns in our world, in our lives, may we, like Abram, have permission to ask questions, trusting that God will answer them. But this passage also makes it very abundantly clear that God's timing is not our time. I know we say that adage a lot, but seriously, he was 75 when he left Haran. He's going to have Ishmael at 86. He has Isaac at, when he's way older than that, 100 or so. God's timing is not ours. That the children of Israel are going to be in slaves for 400 years. God operates on a time frame that we're not often comfortable with. And so when things get delayed, how do we respond? Do we continue to have faith like Abram? Abram asked questions, and so may we follow suit instead of losing hope when we feel like God has promised something and we have to wait for it. God can do things in our situations. This passage reminds us who our God is as a shield, a defender, a great reward, not angry, but so unlike what we are expecting. God is personal. He answered Abram's questions that Abram had specifically. He was willing to go to great length to be in covenant relationship with Abram, faithful to the covenant even with the blood of his son. And so what an amazing God we worship and serve. And may we follow in Abram's footsteps. May we believe and know for God's glory. Amen.